Stay tuned for another original Studio B production right here on the Voice 17104.com.
Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to the Richard James Show on 17104, The Voice. Greetings, my friends, and salutations. Welcome again to the Richard James Show. You know, we just finished up the actually number one holiday on the calendar, which is Christmas. And during this particular period of time, we're still dealing with a worldwide major virus that is, shall we say, caused millions of deaths, millions of hospitalizations. And you have some people who are still denying in existence when death is right in front of them. So we are really dealing with this problem. So we are trying to deal with this. We had a wonderful Christmas. We were able for the first time in a couple of years to bring the grandchildren in and just to meet with them, to see them. They were all good. Everybody was masked up. There wasn't a lot of social discipline. I mean, separation, but we were able to do that, and I think that we all had a good time. So what we're doing today is that we want to talk about the unknown things about our history, African American history, unknown, little known things. And we're going to go into several areas to take a look at it. You know, Christmas is a celebration of the birth of Jesus Christ. Of course, Easter is the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But we know that Christmas is the nativity. And we take a look back at his birth. And we ask the question, what was his lineage? We know he came here in human form. Some people saying that, oh my God, Angel Gabriel was his father and all. I mean, it's just ridiculous stuff. Jesus Christ was also a human being, as well as the Son of God. So there is a lineage. There is a human genetic lineage to Jesus Christ. And who was he? Was he a Judean? Was he a member of the tribe of Judea, which was in the southern part of Israel? Or was he from another tribe? One thing, we have a video here that's going to trace the genetic lineage of Jesus Christ. We want to take a look at it and see exactly what it is. You know, a lot of this is just history. Some stuff that we think we know, we really don't know. One other thing that we remember is the Dead Sea Scrolls. Normally we talk about the books that are in the Bible, but we found hundreds of pages of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were portions of the Bible that we didn't know existed. Historical document, and I understand that it was somehow purchased for several $100,000. Me, I can't understand why it didn't purchase for several $1,000,000 in terms of the value of the content and the kind of information that we get. So we are looking forward to getting more information in terms of what is happening with the Dead Sea Scroll. And the other question is, when people are asking, what was Jesus' ethnicity? And particularly when we talk about his genes and we talk about his family lineage, what was Jesus' ethnicity? Do we know his ethnicity? Yeah, I don't know if we do or not. Do we know the ethnicity of Jesus Christ? We should know his ethnicity. There were several tribes. There were like 12 real known tribes of Israel and the tribe of Judea. Where did Jesus come from? Where are we going to? And we know that a part of his lineage, his heritage, was David and Solomon, both of who ruled the nation of Jerusalem at one point. So we have a lot to learn. We have a lot to say. We have a lot to look at, and we have a long history. And one thing that's happened in this country is that we as African Americans mostly are Christian. And actually, and just to tell it like it is, we adopted the religion of our oppressors. Most of the white slave owners were so-called Christians. Some of those folks believe in white power. Some of those folks who were so-called Christians went into Africa, gave us the Bible, and they took the land. That's the reality. And in terms of the ethnicity of these people, it's crazy. But Christianity, and we know that there are three major religions that came out of this part of the country. We know they refer to it as the Middle East, but Egypt is not in the Middle East. Egypt is in Africa. North Africa is Africa. We have some other countries, Baghdad, Iraq, other countries that are in, shall we say, Eastern Asia. But at any rate, we've got to take a look at exactly what it is and what's going on, who we're talking about. I tell you what, let's get started. We're going to get started on our first video that's going to deal with the ethnicity of Jesus Christ.
Today I'm going to show you the family tree of the ancient Israelite kings. I'll be starting with the kings of the legendary United Monarchy, which include David and Solomon. And then I'll be going through both the kings of Israel in the north and the kings of Judah in the south. Many of these later kings are known to be historical, so along the way, I'll be pointing out some of the archaeological evidence that we have for their existence. This video is part of my series on biblical genealogy, so if you haven't yet watched the earlier parts and want to do that first, you can find a link to those in the description. So the most famous king of ancient Israel is King David. On this chart, I've used Michelangelo's statue of him. But David was not the first king of Israel. The first king was actually a man named Saul. Prior to Saul, the 12 tribes of Israel were said to have been ruled by a series of judges, who were basically temporary leaders who led armies during times of crisis. But according to the Bible, the people eventually got tired of that system and demanded to have a king. So they drew lots, and in the end, Saul from the tribe of Benjamin was chosen. This marked the beginning of what's referred to as the United Monarchy, which means that all 12 tribes of Israel were united under a single king. Now, as I mentioned in part 1, there is no evidence outside of the Bible that a united Israelite kingdom ever actually existed. When we look at the archaeological record for this time period, what we find is a bunch of small Israelite villages with seemingly no centralized government. This greatly contrasts with the biblical description of the period, which paints Israel as being a large, powerful, and extremely wealthy nation. So the most likely conclusion is that these first few kings are more legendary than historical. This means that they likely did exist, but were perhaps more akin to local tribal chieftains than mighty kings, and that the Bible exaggerates their power. With that said, let's continue the story. During Saul's reign, a young hero named David from the tribe of Judah starts to grow in popularity after an incident in which David was able to kill an enemy giant named Goliath. After that event, David joins Saul's army, becomes best friends with Saul's eldest son Jonathan, and even marries one of Saul's daughters, named Michal. He then goes on to be very successful in several battles against the Israelites' main enemy, the Philistines. Eventually, Saul becomes jealous of David and tries to have him killed, forcing David to go into hiding. Then, both Saul and Jonathan die in a battle against the Philistines. At this point, the tribe of Judah declares David to be their king, but the rest of the tribes choose Saul's only remaining son, Ishbosheth. There's a 7-year civil war between the two sides, and eventually Abner, who was Saul's main general, as well as his first cousin, switches sides and supports David. Soon thereafter, Ishbosheth is killed by his own men, and David becomes king of all Israel. He makes Jerusalem his capital, and in total he reigns 40 years. So let's now look at David's tree in more detail. David was the youngest son of a man named Jesse, who in turn was the son of Obed. And Obed was the son of Boaz and Ruth, the two main characters from the book of Ruth. So basically, Ruth was David's great-grandmother. I'd also like to point out David's nephew Joab, who was the son of one of his sisters. He becomes David's main general and features quite prominently in the story of David's life. Oh, and remember David's best friend Jonathan? Well, Jonathan had a disabled son named Mephibosheth, who David adopts after he becomes king. Now, I've already mentioned that David married one of Saul's daughters, but he also married 7 other women and had at least 18 children. His firstborn son and heir was named Amnon, but there's a story in the Bible in which Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar, who was the full sister of Absalom. Absalom seeks revenge and has Amnon killed. Later, Absalom instigates a coup against his father David and tries to take the throne. But following a battle, Absalom gets his long, beautiful hair stuck in the branches of a tree. Joab finds Absalom and, disobeying David's orders to take him alive, kills him, for which Joab ends up losing his job. Another famous story associated with David is the story of David and Bathsheba, in which David sees Bathsheba bathing on a rooftop and conspires to have her husband killed in battle so that he could marry her. So, yeah, as literary figures go, David is a pretty complicated character. He does a lot of good things, but he also does a bunch of bad things too. But generally, he's seen as a good guy because he always seems to repent and learn from his mistakes. Anyway, he has a son with Bathsheba named Solomon, and it is Solomon that ends up becoming the next king. Now, there's 2 other sons of David shown on the chart. I include Adonijah because when David dies, there's a failed attempt by him to take the throne. And I show Nathan because, according to the Gospel of Luke, it is through Nathan that Jesus links back to David. I'll be doing a separate video on the genealogies of Jesus, so keep an eye out for that. Okay, so Solomon is mostly remembered as being the one who builds the first temple, as well as for being really wise, really rich, and for supposedly having 1,000 wives. One of his wives was possibly the Queen of Sheba. She's mentioned only briefly in the Bible, but in Ethiopian tradition, the story is told in more detail. There, she is said to have had a son named Menelik, who becomes the king of Ethiopia and the progenitor of the Solomonic dynasty. If you're interested to learn more about that line, I've got a separate video on that topic, which I'll link to in the description. So, like his father David, Solomon reigns for a total of 40 years. The fact that both these kings have nice, round, very symbolic reign lengths is further evidence that they are likely legendary figures, as opposed to strictly historical ones. So, after the reign of Solomon, the kingdom splits in 2. The tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the south continue to be ruled by the house of David in Jerusalem, and are known as the Kingdom of Judah. Whereas in the north, the 10 remaining tribes declare independence and become known as the Kingdom of Israel. Their first king is a man named Jeroboam, who was from the tribe of Ephraim, which was the largest of the 12 tribes. Let's look at the Kingdom of Israel first, and then we'll go back and look at the Kingdom of Judah second. So in Israel, we get several ruling dynasties. Jeroboam is followed by his son Nadab, but 2 years into his reign, Nadab is killed by one of his army captains named Baasha, and Baasha becomes king instead. Baasha was from the tribe of Issachar. But then history repeats itself. He has a decently long reign and passes things on to his son Elah, but then after just 2 years, Elah is assassinated by one of his army commanders, a man named Zimri. But Zimri is unable to hold on to power and commits suicide after just 7 days as king. At this point, there's a civil war. Some of the people support Tibni, who was probably a relative of Zimri, but others support Omri, who was likely from the tribe of Issachar, like Baasha and Elah. Eventually, Omri's side wins, and he becomes the sole king. Now, Omri is a very important figure. Strangely, unlike many other Bible characters, his name is not well known today. However, in my opinion, he was one of the most important kings in ancient Israel. He holds the distinction of being the earliest known person in the entire Bible, for which we have evidence in the archaeological record. So you'll notice that he has a red check mark next to his name, kind of like the verification symbols you see on social media. On this chart, whenever you see a red check mark, it means that we have a source outside of the Bible that confirms the existence of that person in real life. So let's talk quickly about how we know Omri was a real historical king. If you're ever in Paris, you can check out the following artifact at the Louvre. It's called the Mesha Stele and comes from the ancient kingdom of Moab, which today would be part of Jordan. It dates to just a few decades after the reign of Omri and describes Omri, king of Israel, capturing some Moabite territory. The name Omri shows up on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, which is now housed at the British Museum in London. I'll be talking about this artifact more in a bit, but for now, note that it clearly mentions the phrase House of Omri, indicating that other nations at the time knew that the kingdom of Israel was being ruled by a dynasty that started with Omri. Omri is also important because he founded the city of Samaria, which went on to be the capital of the northern kingdom for the rest of its existence. Anyway, Omri was followed by his son Ahab, and the Bible talks a lot more about him and also about his wife, Jezebel. Ahab and Jezebel were the king and queen of Israel at the time that the prophet Elijah lived, Elijah being one of the more famous prophets in Jewish history. The Bible paints Ahab as being a very wicked king, influenced strongly by his wife Jezebel, who was a Phoenician and thus not an Israelite. From a literary point of view, Jezebel is an interesting figure because in most cases she is portrayed as the ultimate evil seductress. But on the other hand, those who see the evil seductress trope as being a dangerous stereotype and an attempt to discredit strong, confident women, Jezebel has actually become somewhat of a feminist icon. Anyway, we do not have any corroborating evidence for the existence of Jezebel, but we do have mention of her father and brother in a now lost history of Tyre that was quoted by Josephus. Her brother, Baal Esser II, was supposedly the grandfather of the legendary queen Dido, who is said to have founded the city of Carthage. So that's an interesting link there. One thing to keep in mind about the biblical account of the Northern Kingdom is that it was primarily written and edited much later by scribes from the Southern Kingdom. So there's an obvious bias toward the monotheistic religion that developed at Jerusalem and that went on to evolve into what's called Second Temple Judaism, which in turn led to the development of the better known Rabbinical Judaism, as well as Christianity and Islam. So basically, from the Southern Kingdom's perspective, the Northern Kingdom was seen as being disobedient to the one true God, Hashem. Ahab and Jezebel were famous for promoting the worship of the god Baal instead. So whenever something went wrong, the Southerners blamed it on the fact that the Northerners worshipped the wrong god or gods. Ahab has a red checkmark because he shows up in a set of Assyrian monuments, known as the Kirk monoliths, currently located at the British Museum. In those inscriptions, the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III claims that he defeated 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers of Ahab the Israelite. According to the Bible, he's killed during a war with the kingdom of Judah and is followed by his sons Ahaziah and Jehoram. Jehoram's name appears on an artifact known as the Tel Dan Stele, which was discovered in the 1990s and currently is housed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. That inscription confirms a story told in the Bible in which Jehoram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, are defeated by Hazael, king of Aram Damascus. I'll talk more about the Tel Dan Stele when we talk about Judah, but in the Bible's version, a man named Jehu ends up replacing Jehoram as king of Israel. It's at this point that Jezebel is killed by being pushed out of a window. Although the Bible doesn't make it clear, it's possible that Jehu was a descendant of Omri through a junior branch. In fact, his name appears on the black obelisk of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, where he is described as Jehu, son of Omri, most likely meaning Jehu from the house of Omri. But the black obelisk is even more important because it actually includes an image of Jehu bowing down and giving gifts to Shalmaneser. This is the first and only contemporary image we have of an ancient Israelite king. Things seem to have stabilized at this point because after Jehu's reign, we get a series of 4 father-son successions. I'll point out Jehoash because his name appears in the archaeological record as well. He is mentioned in the stele of Adad Nirari III, now located in Baghdad at the Iraq Museum. There, he is referred to as the King of Samaria, which is the earliest reference we have outside of the Bible of that particular city. We don't have any direct evidence outside of the Bible for a king named Jeroboam II. However, in one verse, it describes an earthquake that occurred during Jeroboam II's reign. And according to the geological record, we know that there was indeed a big earthquake in the region around 760 BCE, which fits. So following Jeroboam II, things start to go downhill. His son Zechariah is assassinated in his first year and replaced with an army commander, who in turn is assassinated after just 1 month and replaced with another army commander named Menahem. Menahem is mentioned in the annals of Tiglath-Pileser III as being one of the many kings who paid him tribute. He was eventually followed by his son Pekahiah, who, like so many Israelite kings, was eventually assassinated and replaced with one of his army commanders. That king, named Pekah, is also mentioned in Assyrian records as paying tribute to Tiglath-Pileser. And guess what happened to Pekah? Yep, he was assassinated and replaced by one of his army commanders. This fact is confirmed in Assyrian records. That king, named Hoshea, would be the last king of Israel. He made a deal with Egypt in the hopes of avoiding paying tribute to Assyria. That was a bad move because Assyria, now led by Shalmaneser V, responded by conquering the kingdom for good and destroying their capital at Samaria. So over here, I've been pointing out several of the Assyrian kings. Unlike the ancient Israelite kings, the existence of all of them can be confirmed by the archaeological record. So instead of giving them all a red check mark, what I've done instead is give the ones that are mentioned by name in the Bible a little blue check mark. So that's what those symbols mean. Okay, let's now look at the southern kingdom of Judah. There, King Solomon was followed by his son Rehoboam, whose mother was a non-Israelite named Naamah. She came from the nearby kingdom of Ammon, now located in Jordan. And interestingly, Rehoboam married a granddaughter of Absalom. So in a way, Absalom's line did end up on the throne in the end. He was followed by their son Abijah, and then by Asa, who had a long and peaceful reign. Generally, the Bible describes the kings of Judah as being good kings, who destroyed idols and encouraged the worship of the one true God, in contrast with the kings of Israel, who did the opposite, and were therefore punished with more internal conflict. Next in line in Judah comes Jehoshaphat, who was a contemporary with Elijah, Ahab, and Jezebel. In fact, his son Jehoram married a daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. Together, that couple had Ahaziah, who, as I mentioned earlier, allied with his uncle, King Jehoram of Israel, against the king of Aram Damascus. Which brings me back to the Tel Dan Stele, which describes the incident. In that inscription, it appears to read, Amaziah, son of Jehoram, of the house of David. This is important because it is the earliest reference in the archaeological record to the House of David. But note that it doesn't directly reference David as king, nor does it describe anything that David did. Instead, it simply references the existence of a royal dynasty named after someone called David. This is a bit different from the reference to the House of Omri, being that Omri lived just a few decades before the earliest mention of his name, whereas David lived over 100 years before the earliest mention of his name. This is why David is still considered to be more of a legendary figure, whereas Omri is considered more of a historical figure. Anyhow, Ahaziah died following the conflict with Aram Damascus. At this point, his mother, Queen Athaliah, became the ruling monarch, the only monarch of the kingdom of Judah that was a female, and the only one that did not belong to the paternal line of David. Remember, she was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. She proceeded to kill all the possible claimants to the throne of Judah, but she missed one because, unbeknownst to her, a relative smuggled away and hid one of Ahaziah's sons, who was just a baby at the time. When that child, named Joash, was 7, he was revealed, and with the help of the priests, he was made king, thus reestablishing the line of David. He would be the first of 2 child kings who feature prominently in the biblical story of ancient Israel. He was followed by Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, most of whom are attested to somehow in the archaeological record. For example, a royal seal has been found belonging to Ahaz, son of Jotham, thus confirming the names of these 2 kings. Hezekiah is generally considered to be one of the greatest kings in the history of ancient Israel. He reigned shortly after the fall of the northern kingdom, and he used the opportunity to reorganize and strengthen the kingdom of Judah. Prior to this, the kingdom of Israel was by far the larger and more important of the 2 kingdoms. This is why the idea of a united monarchy, ruled by a southern dynasty, the House of David, is most likely just a legend that was created later in order to make Judah seem more important. Either way, it was definitely at this point that the kingdom of Judah did become larger and more important. One can imagine that there were likely lots of refugees streaming down from the ruins of the northern cities, and that this led to a population boom in the southern cities. There is certainly a lot of archaeological findings from this period, both from Assyrian records as well as from evidence found in Jerusalem. For example, we know that Hezekiah rebuilt the walls around Jerusalem in preparation for an Assyrian attack. Remnants of these walls can still be seen today. It is also thought that he is the one who ordered the construction of the Siloam Tunnel, another feature in Jerusalem that still exists today. The Bible also mentions 2 major historical figures who existed at the same time as Hezekiah: Sennacherib, king of Assyria, and Taharka, king of Cush, who was also a pharaoh of Egypt. It was during the reign of Hezekiah that the prophet Isaiah lived, the first of the 4 so-called major prophets. It is thought that Isaiah was probably a grandson of King Josiah, and thus a member of the royal family. It is also possible that he was Hezekiah's father-in-law. However, the most important thing to mention about Hezekiah is that the Assyrians did in fact attack the kingdom of Judah during his reign, which was a logical next step after having destroyed the kingdom of Israel. However, Hezekiah was able to hold them off, and thus Judah survived and went on to become the main power in the Levant over the next century. He was followed by his son Manasseh, who is also mentioned in Assyrian records, and then by Ahaz, who was assassinated after just 2 years on the throne. This led to an 8-year-old boy named Josiah becoming king. Although Josiah is not nearly as famous as Kings David and Solomon, I would actually argue that he was much more important, for it was Josiah who laid the foundation for what became Second Temple Judaism, which in turn, as I mentioned earlier, was the religion from which Rabbinical Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all stemmed from. Biblical scholars have concluded that it was during the reign of Josiah that the original parts of the book of Deuteronomy were written. And some scholars even believe that this core part of Deuteronomy was actually the earliest part of the Bible to be written. One theory is that the story of Joshua's conquest of Canaan was invented in order to inspire the people living during Josiah's time to conquer the lands to the north that had recently been laid waste by the Assyrians, and that the story of the united monarchy was invented in order to legitimize the House of David's rule over the entire land of Israel. Whether or not this is true, we do know for certain that Josiah did try to conquer the northern areas during his reign. But unfortunately, he failed, and in fact, he died in the process. According to the Bible, he was killed by a pharaoh named Necho, who we know from Egyptian records was in fact a historical pharaoh that had just recently come to power at that exact time. After the death of Josiah, Judah started to decline rapidly. 3 of his sons and 1 of his grandsons followed him as king. And it was his 3rd son, Zedekiah, who would be the final king of Judah. By this point, the Babylonians had conquered Assyria and were now the major power in the Middle East. Their famous king, Nebuchadnezzar, defeated the kingdom of Judah and destroyed Jerusalem, along with its temple, in 586 BCE. At this point, most of the Jews were transported to Babylon, where they then lived in exile. The 2nd and 3rd of the 4 major prophets are Jeremiah and Ezekiel. They both lived during the final days of Judah and during the early part of the exile. Jeremiah was the son of the high priest Hilkiah, who served during the reign of King Josiah. The 4th and final major prophet is Daniel. He is thought to be a literary invention, not a historical figure. According to most scholars, the book of Daniel was the last book of the Hebrew Bible to be written, and is usually dated to the Maccabean period. However, the story places Daniel and his 3 companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as members of the Jewish royal family, living in exile in Babylon, and later Persia. Although the reign of the House of David officially came to an end in 586 BCE, there was a position known as the Exilarch that survived much longer. The Exilarch was basically the leader of the Jewish community in Babylon. Early exilarchs include Jeconiah's son Shealtiel and grandson Zerubbabel. The genealogy given in the Gospel of Matthew traces the line leading to Jesus back to Zerubbabel. Information on the exilarchs after Zerubbabel and their exact genealogy is pretty sketchy. However, they are mentioned on and off in historical records all the way up to the year 1258 CE, which is when Baghdad fell to the grandson of Genghis Khan. Another title that has been used throughout Jewish history, both in the Levant and in the European diaspora, is Nasi, which means prince. Whether or not certain individuals who used the name Nasi, or anyone else for that matter, are direct male line descendants of the House of David is something that cannot really be proved one way or another. There are lots of fanciful theories that try to connect various dynasties back to the Davidic line, such as the Merovingians, but none of these are taken seriously by historians. So that was a look at the kings of ancient Israel and Judah. Be sure to check out the links in the description for the other videos in this series on biblical genealogy.
You know, Ezekiel saw that wheel. It was a big wheel, kept turning over. You know, Ezekiel saw that wheel, and it was way up in the middle of the air. Oh, the voice of the prophet. We heard a voice, a prophet. He said, go to the children of Israel and tell them I said to sin no more. And we'll Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There used to be a musical group called the Gospel Cliffs during my era in the 60s and 70s. They were one of the most popular groups you can ever see. And they put together some beautiful, beautiful songs that portray some of that. So, hey, you got detail now. You got some things I'm sure you didn't know, and some things you probably did know. And this gave you some specific information about the lines, the genetic lines in Israel. One thing that I noticed that this particular video, that all their images were white. And let me correct that. That was a lie. That was not true. It was hard to get historical information without ethnicity, and to suggest that the entire nation of Judea was European, blue eyes, blonde hair, was absolutely not true. But we got other videos and other information that we want you to take a look at and you will learn from. Okay, we're going to take a look at our next video, and let's see what we can learn from that. Okay.
The Dead Sea, one of the most inhospitable places on the planet. At 1,300 meters below sea level, the shores of this desolate salt lake are the lowest place on Earth. Although the River Jordan, a sacred place for time immemorial, flows into it, there is nowhere for the water to go. Its only release being the punishing sun evaporating it during the course of each day, leaving just salt and mineral behind. This is very likely the saltiest body of water on the planet, more so than the Great Salt Lake of Utah. Just a few gulps of this liquid will kill a human in a matter of hours. Not only that, but deep sinkholes regularly appear all over its banks, threatening to open up and swallow those foolish enough to wander too close to the shore. Yet, all the same, people have not only lived here, but on many occasions thrived for thousands upon thousands of years. This is Bible country. According to biblical archaeologists, on one edge of this lake, the once prosperous cities of Sodom and Gomorrah may have once thrived. The similarly ancient city of Jericho and a whole multitude of other biblical sites are located only a few days' walk away. And later still, salt merchants from the Bronze Age to the Ottoman era risked their lives to brave the harsh, deadly still waters of the sea. It was also here, generations later, in the spring of 1947, as Palestine teetered on the verge of a new war, that 3 young Bedouin boys, their ancestors having wandered the region as nomads for time immemorial, stopped at the ancient watering hole of Rash Feshka to rest their animals. The story goes that one of the boys wandered off from the main group. Bored, he began throwing rocks into some nearby caves. When he heard the loud crash of pottery breaking, he stopped in his tracks. Clearly, one of his projectiles had made contact with some sort of an item inside the cave. A single thought entered his mind: treasure. He ran back down the cliff to tell his friends, but night was swiftly approaching. Upon investigating the next day, the boys were disappointed to find that the cave did not contain buried treasure, but a simple collection of clay pots, one of them broken with a number of ancient scrolls spilled out of it onto the cave floor. Little did they know it at the time, but those Bedouin shepherds had just made the single greatest discovery in the entire history of biblical archaeology and Jewish Second Temple period studies. It was perhaps the most famous archaeological discovery of the 20th century, and soon to become a cultural icon, famous the world over. For those pots contained the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This video is sponsored by Magellan TV, a brand new educational streaming service with over 2,000 documentaries to watch on all manner of different subjects. Magellan's producers and curators have brought together an astounding collection of documentaries on history, science, nature, culture, and geography. These include films, series, and exclusive playlists you can't find anywhere else. Like Netflix, this is a streaming service, but made just for documentary lovers and knowledge seekers. You can watch Magellan anywhere at any time on any device, directly through the high-quality app, which also offers a wide selection of content in 4K at no extra cost. There are no ads or limited access at any time, and the best part, new documentaries are added on a weekly basis. Recently, I've been watching Tony Robinson talk about the ancient gods of Britain, as well as Terry Jones of Monty Python fame doing what he does best and talking about the weirder side of history. The first 100 people who sign up by using my link below or by going to magellantv.com/historytime will get a 1-month free trial. So what are you waiting for? Head on over and get yourself some free knowledge. In 1947, once more the dark shadows of war fell upon the Middle East, and to the world at large, as chaos tore through the region over the next 2 years, the whereabouts of those ancient scrolls discovered by the Dead Sea remained shrouded in mystery. Unbeknownst to the world at large, just before the outbreak of war, the Bedouins who had found the initial scrolls had sold them on to a Syrian Orthodox priest in Jerusalem for the meagre sum of around $250. Those who read the scrolls at this time were the first to do so in over 2,000 years, noting incredulously that they were nearly identical to the Old Testament Bible that we know today. But, as we shall see, the Dead Sea Scrolls offered so much more. By the time relative stability and a new nation, Israel, surfaced by around 1950, the whereabouts of the scrolls still remained largely hidden. It wasn't until 1954, when an anonymous ad was placed in the Wall Street Journal, that they eventually resurfaced. They'd been smuggled into America and put up for sale. When they were bought, this time by a travelling Israeli archaeologist on the behalf of his country, the price was an astounding $250,000, 1,000 times more than the price given to the Bedouin. As news came out all over the world that the scrolls were the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible ever found, having only 13 or so minor variants from the 10th century Aleppo Codex. As well as the huge amounts of money involved, the race was on for archaeologists and Bedouin tribesmen to find more of the same out in the desert. Eventually, by 1956, a total of 11 caves containing scrolls had been found. 5 of them natural and 6 man-made, carved out of the soft rock of the region. Astonishingly, all had remained untouched since they were first deposited there some 2,000 years before. They contained somewhere around 800 manuscripts. The scrolls were written in a variety of languages: Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, the various languages spoken in the region 2,000 years ago. Astonishingly, they contained a huge wealth of writings, including alternate versions of biblical texts, along with completely original works never before seen. Hypothesized to be a long-lost library, the scrolls provide a fascinating glimpse into the long-lost world of an extinct religious sect that existed at the same time Jesus walked the earth. The scrolls can be broadly categorized into 3 distinct sections. Firstly are the Old Testament biblical documents, mostly identical to the Bible we know today. Interestingly, one of the first scrolls discovered is known as the Genesis Apocryphon, an alternative version of the book of Genesis written in Aramaic, which contains a long-lost conversation between Noah and his father Lamech, which isn't in the Bible. Second are texts relating to the everyday life and literary heritage of the period, many being written in Greek and Latin, the languages of administration during the later Second Temple period of Judaism. Perhaps the most interesting of all, however, and certainly the most controversial, is the third grouping, the sectarian scrolls. These describe the life and teachings of the people who made the writings, a secretive apocalyptic group who refer to themselves as the Sons of Light. Radiocarbon dating had only just been introduced by the 1950s and was deemed too unreliable and potentially damaging to be used to date the scrolls. Instead, paleographic dating was used, literally meaning the study of writing. Though later on, less invasive carbon-14 dating was also implemented. All of these methods conclusively dated the texts to the same roughly 300-year period, from the 3rd century BC all the way up to the 1st century AD, an incredibly important time for the history of the world. Also in the 1950s, just as the scrolls were being deciphered, the nearby archaeological site of Habat Qumran was investigated too. In time, most scholars came to agree that this site, only around a day's walk from Jerusalem, yet nonetheless completely isolated out in the desert, had been the base of the Sons of Light. Scholarly consensus often differs wildly on the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially given the sheer amount of research that has been done on them, large chunks of it bordering on pseudo-history. Yet practically all scholars do agree on one thing, backed up by chronology and later by archaeological evidence, that the scrolls were hidden away during the first Jewish revolt against Rome, a vicious conflict that lasted from 66 until 70 AD, and ended with the complete razing of Jerusalem and the Jewish temple. Presumably, the fighting was so intense that the members of the sect never came back to retrieve their library, leaving it to be rediscovered some 2,000 years later. So what of the secretive sect itself? The writings of the Sons of Light have captivated the world ever since they were first discovered, sparking literally thousands of books being written as to who they were, and most importantly for many, what they mean for Christianity. According to the scrolls, like early Christian ascetics or monks, the Sons of Light had given up their earthly possessions to live out in the desert in a communal existence. Whilst there, they attempted to gain wisdom and achieve salvation by communing with angels, a belief generally denied by mainstream Judaism at the time. We also find dualist, apocalyptic elements, perhaps derived in part from Zoroastrianism, and reminiscent of later Christian heresies such as that of the Bogomils and the Cathars. Unlike the early Christian community, however, the Sons of Light turned their backs on the meek and the weak, for example, rejecting the blind on the grounds that they could not see impurity, and the deaf because they could not hear the correct Gospels. They also seem to have been an almost exclusively male and Jewish affair, having extremely difficult initiation rituals. Aside from this, however, as reflected by the Thanksgiving Scroll, which lists various prayers and sayings of the sect, there are many similarities with early Christianity, sparking numerous scholars to suggest links between the two groups, with Christianity perhaps being some sort of an offshoot. One of the most interesting of the documents discovered is the War Scroll, clearly showing that the Sons of Light were waiting for a final apocalyptic battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, called the Sons of Darkness. It even outlines battle plans and strategies for the coming war. You can listen to this fascinating and controversial scroll over on our second channel, Voices of the Past, and don't forget to subscribe for other fascinating historical content. The War Scroll is made all the more interesting by the revelation of another document in the late 1960s called the Temple Scroll. This had been hidden away in a shoebox until after the Six-Day War in 1967, and includes detailed instructions for a temple that was never built. complete with regulations and sacrifices, perhaps for after the successful completion of the war. Another famous extract is a commentary on the book of Habakkuk from the Hebrew Bible. It speaks of three prominent figures, all of whom have become incredibly controversial and written about. The first is the teacher of righteousness, associated with all manner of historical figures, such as Jesus' brother James the Just and John the Baptist. Second is the wicked priest, perhaps either referring to the priests and kings of mainstream Judaism, or, according to independent scholar Barbara Thering, to Jesus himself. The third is the man of the lie, another controversial figure, interpreted differently by vast amounts of scholars. The third and fourth caves, however, sparked off perhaps the greatest amount of discussion of all. In the third cave was a scroll completely different to all the others. Rather than being written on leather, this one was made on copper, and quite simply, it's a treasure map. A detailed set of instructions to 64 treasures hidden somewhere, presumably in the Holy Land. Despite numerous attempts and expeditions, no one, in the 20th century at least, has ever found any of the treasures. Maybe, like Bronze Age burial mounds in Europe, and most of the Egyptian pyramids, they were discovered and looted in antiquity. Yet, every few years, a new theory resurfaces to the contrary, and occasionally new expeditions are launched to find them. It was in cave number 4, however, that the greatest mystery of all was found. The scrolls here had fallen on the ground at some time in antiquity and smashed into tens of thousands of tiny pieces, some of them no larger than a tiny pebble. Over the next 40 years, the scrolls of Cave 4 were worked on by an elite group of mostly Catholic scholars, with no one else even being allowed to see them. Of course, this created all manner of conspiracy theories about Vatican cover-ups and sparked a huge amount of hostility from other scholars, especially when a story was leaked that one translation talked of the leader of the Sons of Light being crucified, suggesting a definitive link with Jesus, though this eventually turned out to have been false. Finally, by the 1980s, one professor and his graduate students were entrusted with index cards that they'd been given, known as a compendium, copies of which had been given out only to trusted scholars. This professor and his students went on to write a computer program which matched the cards up and reconstructed the original contents of the fragments. Though it's not a perfect system and can be fairly subjective, it's said to have around a 90% accuracy rate. At the same time, secret photographs.
We have seen much of this video, the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're giving you a taste of it. You can see it yourself. You can go up on YouTube and take a look at it. The Dead Sea Scrolls. A lot of interesting material, historical material. The Dead Sea Scrolls has been in controversy ever since they found it. And we want to move ahead. And one thing that I am particularly interested in is the ethnicity of some of these folk. Now, we know that in Egypt, that one of the original people, Egypt were Nubians. And Nubians were, some people refer to them as Ethiopians, or they are people of color. We have a white gentleman that we were getting ready to show. Will give his opinion on the ethnicity of Israelites. Okay, we're gonna roll the next video. Okay, our last one. Take care. We're gonna go.
Hi, I'm Jeffrey, and right now we are going to look at the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, if you're familiar with the Bible, then you know that it falls into two large sections. There's the Old Testament, which looks at the relationship between ancient Israel and their God. And then there's the New Testament, which follows the life and teachings of Jesus and some of his close followers thereafter. Now, if you read through the Bible, you find the number 12 showing up over and over again. And that number was very important to the nation of Israel because they saw their nation as a collection of 12 large families called tribes. And these tribes show up over and over again throughout the Bible. So let's get a high-level overview of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, the 12 tribes of Israel come from 12 patriarchs. Israel was not just the name of the nation, but it was also the name of Jacob, who was the father of the entire nation of Israel. And so the 12 tribes of Israel come from the names of the 12 sons of Israel, or the 12 patriarchs. Now you can find this list of Jacob's sons several times in Genesis. You can read some of the stories of how they were born in chapters 29 and 30. In chapter 35, you get a very succinct summary of the children of Israel. And then in chapters 48 and 49, you see some of the prophetic blessings that Jacob gives to his sons. But for now, what we want to do is just get a high-level overview of who these people are. There was a lot of drama in the original family of Israel. So these 12 sons actually come from 4 different mothers. You have 6 sons coming from the mother Leah. And Leah was Jacob's first wife, but not his favorite. That goes to Rachel. Rachel was his second wife and the one that he loved the most. So we have 6 sons of Leah: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun. Jacob had 2 concubines as well. These were the servants of Leah and Rachel. They wanted to have more children, and so they had more children in those days through these concubine mothers. So you have Bilhah, which is where Dan and Naphtali come from, and Zilpah, which is where Gad and Asher come from. Then Rachel has some children of her own. Joseph, that's the very famous one with that colorful coat. And Joseph has 2 sons of his own, Manasseh and Ephraim. And then we have Benjamin, who is the youngest of the original 12. These men all had families, and at the end of the book of Genesis, we see all of them journeying to the land of Egypt to avoid a famine. And in Egypt, over the course of 400 years, so the story of Genesis and Exodus goes, these 12 families grow and multiply into 12 tribes, and they become a mighty nation with these 12 families and clans that make them up. Now, in the book of Exodus, we find everyone in Egypt, and then they start making their journey from Egypt to the land that God promised to Jacob's grandfather, Abraham. And on the way to them actually getting those territories, we see a few tribes emerge as more significant. Those tribes are Levi, Judah, and Ephraim. Now, Levi is super important to understanding the rest of what's going on in the Old Testament. This is the tribe that Moses comes from. And there's this moment, a rather famous Bible story, when Moses goes up the mountain to meet with God, and the rest of the nation is down at the foot of the mountain, and they make a golden calf and start worshiping that. Well, Moses isn't very happy about that. He says, who is for the Lord here? And only the tribe of Levi responds with loyalty for the God of Israel. And so Levi is loyal when the rest of Israel is worshiping this golden calf, and they are blessed for that loyalty to God. Similarly, later on, Moses sends one representative from each tribe into the promised land to explore and spy out the land. The spies come back, and of the 12 spies, only 2 give a positive report. Only 2 of them believe that the people of Israel will be protected by God as they go into the promised land. One of those two is Caleb, and he represents the tribe of Judah. Caleb is loyal to God and to Moses. The rest of the nation wants to kill Moses and his brother Aaron, who is the high priest, the tribe of Levi, and go back to Egypt. Caleb resists this, and he is blessed. He lives to see the promised land, which, if you are familiar with the book of Numbers, you know that most people die out in the wilderness from Caleb's generation. There's another exception to this rule, and that's the representative from Ephraim, Joshua. Joshua is a very famous Bible character. Not only is he loyal to Moses during this incident, but he has been serving Moses his entire life from when he was just a young person. And God and Moses select Joshua to lead the people into the promised land. And you can read all about that in the book that holds Joshua's name. The particular commission, you can read that episode, though, in Deuteronomy chapter 31. Now, when we get to the book of Joshua, we see the 12 tribes getting 12 territories. And this is where things get kind of interesting. So Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, Issachar, Zebulun, Naphtali, Asher, Simeon, and Dan are all given territories west of the Jordan River in the promised land proper, in the land of Canaan. Before that happens, the 3 tribes ask for the land that lies to the east of the Jordan River. So it's not necessarily in the promised land proper, if you will. It's not in the land of Canaan. It's just across the river on the other side.
We're coming down to the end of our show. We need a little bit more space to get more heavily into this last depiction of the different individual importance in Israel. I hope you got some information out of it. There's more to be had. Maybe we'll do another show where we can lift up some of our information. One thing we want to get into, and then we didn't quite get there, was the ethnicity of some of these folks. I've often heard that the tribe of Judea were people of color. I want to see, what these individuals have to say about that. I want to thank you for tuning in every week, to us, and we try to give you something different. We try to mix this up. We've scheduled far ahead. We have some really interesting individuals that we're going to be bringing in to interview, and some of the individuals that have been on our show and some have never been on our show. But we've got some things that we are lining up for you that you should enjoy. And one thing I want to let people know, that we're still in business. We're still at the Lebanon Valley Farmers Market down in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. We have a whole slew of new djembe drums. We have oils, clothing. We have statues. We still have some leftover Black Santa Clauses. We have all kinds of interesting things that make wonderful presents, wonderful gifts. And so come down and see us. We're there basically on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Now, we won't be there this Saturday because of New Year's Day, but we definitely will be there Thursday, and we'll be there Friday. So we'll be looking forward to seeing you. Yeah, this is a picture of our shop. So thanks again. Thank you for tuning in. Coming again next week, and you'll have some things of interest. Any ideas? Give us a call. Call the station. Let us know if you got some program ideas. We certainly will take it in consideration. So we're gonna say so long. Hasta luego, and look forward to seeing you next week. Take care. Thank you again for tuning in to the Richard James Show.
Our African and our African American programs are set up to educate you on what's going on in this world. We thank you for taking out the time to listen. Let us hear from you sometime also. So this is your neighbor and your friend signing off. Until I see you again next week and hear from you again next week. So long. God bless.